Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello, and welcome to Then and Now. I'm Ben Zdencanovic, the host of this week's episode. Throughout his 2 terms in office, President Donald Trump has invoked a distinctive, if idiosyncratic, vision of American history, from the phrase, "Make America Great Again," to his recent praise of the presidency of William McKinley. Here to discuss the uses and perhaps abuses of history by the Trump administration is Bruce Schulman, William E. Huntington Professor of History at Boston University. Bruce Schulman is the author of many books, including a forthcoming and highly anticipated installment of the Oxford University Press History of the United States series, entitled Brand Name America: The Birth of the Modern United States, 1896 to 1929. Bruce Schulman, welcome to Then and Now.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Ben.
So why don't we start with MAGA, this slogan of Trumpism, Make America Great Again. So there's kind of an implicit historicism, I think, in that phrase, right? The implication being that America was once great in some past era. It's no longer great, but through Trump, it can and will be great again, is the implication. And given that this phrase has really defined Trump's agenda, the Trump movement, since he first ran for office in 2015, I think that's worth kind of breaking down and worth some closer analysis. So what do you make of this phrase and the political work that it has done and is continuing to do for the Trump administration? Why has this phrase had such staying power for so long now, over a decade?
I think the phrase has been so potent and so enduring because it actually speaks to different constituencies near to and around Trump and what we might call the Trumpist or the MAGA now movement that even has, that takes its name from this slogan. And I guess I would point out 3 different meanings or 3 different resonances, or perhaps 3 different kinds of nostalgia for an imagined better past when America was great and that we can now resemble. So one is what that phrase means to Donald Trump himself and to maybe some of the people closest to him, including Elon Musk in the second Trump administration. A second is to ask why this term is appealing to what we might call as the MAGA rank and file, the millions of people who identify with Trump, who voted for him 2 or 3 times, especially, I would say, conservatives and maybe even more especially evangelical Christian conservatives. And then third, what we might call are the shock troops of the MAGA movement, or the insiders, the people like the authors of Project 2025, people like his current budget director, some of the people who have, I think, taken the idea of Make America Great Again and turned it into an actionable agenda. And I think those 3 different groups, or those 3 different constituencies, hear different things or mean different things when they say Make America Great Again. I think for Donald Trump and for Elon Musk, the imagined past that they want to restore is the 1980s. I think for much of the conservative faithful who have come to embrace Trump, especially evangelical Christians, it's the 1950s. And I think for those sort of hardcore theorists, it's really the 1880s or 1890s. Now, why? Well, I think for a lot of conservative Americans who have jumped on the MAGA bandwagon, they're hearing something not all that different from what prior conservatives, from Ronald Reagan to Newt Gingrich, meant by that. That is, a world before the turmoil and the social and cultural changes of the 1960s. One of traditional notions of gender roles and domesticity and a certain kind of nuclear family being celebrated. One in which American greatness and the special, exceptional quality of the United States was really unquestioned. One before the Civil Rights Revolution and the embrace of a more multicultural, ethnically diverse nation. That's the nostalgia is for, if not the real 1950s, which we know were beset by all kinds of anxieties and social tensions, the sort of Happy Days sitcom, Father Knows Best version of the domestic 1950s. I think, though, for Donald Trump, for Elon Musk, for people around him, they have no nostalgia for that kind of 50s domesticity. I think Donald Trump emerged as a public figure in the 1980s. I think there's something about the go-go 80s, about its celebration of wealth, about the power of these new fortunes in real estate, in finance, about their political power as well, but also just about, being able to stick gold on everything and the kind of playboy celebrity that Trump enjoyed. I think that is the kind, and before what they see as the kind of tyranny of political correctness, I think that is sort of what Trump and even Musk are imagining. That's the greatness of America, the greatness era that they are trying to not only evoke, but return to. And then finally, for the sort of what we may call as the hardcore theorists and shock troops of the MAGA agenda, the authors of Project 2025 and so on, I think that they're looking backward to a time before the rise of the modern American state, before the rise of a federal government that had regulatory powers, that was a major player in American economic and social life. They want to undo essentially all of the 20th century. So those are kind of three different ways that this term is powerful and evocative.
Yeah, that's let's hone in on that last one, because I think now in Trump's second term, since he's taken office, he's really specifically been referring to this period he's using the years between 1870 and 1913. He's used these years repeatedly over the past months as the kind of golden age of American prosperity and power. So that seems like quite a specific periodization, right? Why these dates, 1870 to 1913, and what were some broad themes in history that were emerging in the United States and in the world during that period?
Yeah, so it's a quite specific periodization, and it's also a very weird periodization. That is, if your listeners took a high school or college American history course, they probably didn't get that periodization. So I think we should talk maybe what were the major themes of this era, and then why this is kind of a weird way to draw the boundaries around a period, certainly an unconventional way. So we tend to think of the late 19th century, borrowing the term from Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, as the Gilded Age. And certainly this was an era of rapid industrialization and rapid urbanization. It was also an era of mass immigration. So between 1880 and 1913, some 20 million Europeans came to the United States, a massive wave of European immigration. More than 1.5 million people came across the border from Mexico in that period. That might not seem like a lot by contemporary standards, but that was about 10% of the population of Mexico drained out of Mexico across the border to the United States. So a period of mass immigration, but it was also a period of economic volatility, instability, and strife. So as the nation rapidly industrialized, and one product of that industrialization was the creation of huge fortunes, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fricks, and the Vanderbilts, and so on, the so-called robber barons of that era. It was also a time of great instability. So two major economic downturns, the so-called Panic of 1873, which lasted for 4 years, and then the Panic of 1893, which was in fact the deepest depression in American history before the Great Depression of the 1930s, an era of business failures, of mergers. But it was also an era of tremendous labor strife. So as the nation was going through this period of industrialization, there were strikes, there were labor actions, there was vigilante violence, there were riots. So it was a period of economic instability and volatility. And here's where I got to my original point about the oddness of the periodization, and we can explain why that is. Then normally we think of the early 20th century period as being the introduction of a new era, what is normally referred to, maybe problematically, as the progressive era, beginning certainly with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt in 1901, in which the government moved in to regulate this unstable and uncertain marketplace, to try to restrain some of the worst abuses of big businesses and some of the most dangerous conditions for American laborers, and ushered in a period of government regulation of economy and society. What's interesting, though, is that the Trumpists, and this comes out of a tradition of conservative historical writing over the past 40 or 50 years, they put 1870 to 1913 all together, and they see 1913 as an end of an era because for them, certain reforms of the year 1913 and 14, especially the creation of the Federal Reserve System, is their big bugaboo. That is, so they're looking for a time before the Federal Reserve, also before the Federal Trade Commission, though it doesn't loom as large as the Federal Reserve, as their sort of boogeyman of when the federal government and the regulatory state started to mess with American economic life in ways that they think were unproductive and hostile to American freedom. So they see this as a golden age because it is the age before government regulation, even though the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the creation of a set of resource conservation agencies and policies all predated that. So by what you might have learned in high school or college in an American history course is different from this unusual sort of American right-wing periodization of the history.
And Trump has also been increasingly outspoken in his admiration for President William McKinley, and a president that might only be kind of dimly familiar for the average American, right? It's not your typical reference point. So, what do you make of that? Why McKinley? Why is McKinley such an important figure to Donald Trump?
You're absolutely right, Ben, that Trump, at least in the second term, has really been celebrating McKinley. He even mentioned McKinley as an underrated president in his inaugural address, and of course, has made a big deal about the renaming of the tallest mountain in the United States, Denali in Alaska, as Mount McKinley again in order to honor this new favorite president of the current President Trump. In some ways, it's mind-boggling because if you know anything about McKinley as an individual and as a person, he seems so unlike Trump. I mean, if McKinley was famous for anything personally, it was his modesty. So after he was elected president, but before he took office, before his inauguration, one of his old army buddies, pauses because they don't know what to call him. Mr. President, what should he call him now? And McKinley famously said, "Call me Major." That was his highest rank in the army and during the Civil War. "Call me Major. I have earned that rank. I don't know about the other titles." When president, he didn't like that tradition said at White House dinners, the president was served first, even before his wife. He wanted his wife to be served first because that was the modest, gentlemanly thing to do. So very un-Trumpian, I think, in those ways. But I think there are some reasons why Trump has fastened on McKinley as someone to be celebrated. And actually, I would say there are really two reasons. One is William McKinley was the master of the protective tariff in the late 19th century, both as president and even before president as a member of Congress when he was the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee that really took over tariff writing at the time. He was sort of the expert on all things tariff and was the person most closely associated with the idea of protective tariffs in that Gilded Age era. And as we know, Donald Trump loves tariffs. He said that it's his favorite word in the dictionary. In the 3 months or so that since he's come into office, he's been both imposing and removing and threatening all kinds of protective tariffs. So I think the association with tariffs is one thing. The other thing that is maybe a little surprising because it differs so much from Trump's first term is his open embrace of American imperialism and his desire for territorial conquest. So Trump has promised that the United States would acquire Greenland one way or another. He has made noises about taking back the Panama Canal. He's even, of course, referred to Canada as the 51st state in ways that at first seemed like a joke, but maybe now seem like an authentic agenda for territorial aggrandizement. And of course, McKinley was the president that oversaw the United States' first seizure of overseas colonies, taking Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and most importantly, the Philippines in the wake of the war with Spain in 1898.
And let's focus a little bit more specifically on two of those aspects. The first is tariffs. So you mentioned under McKinley, it was the dawn, the golden age of the protective tariff, right? And by protective, we usually think of tariffs as a mechanism to protect domestic industry, right? And I think that's part of how Trump is using tariffs, but he's also using them as leverage, as power, a negotiating tactic with other countries. Is that something that we saw in earlier periods in the McKinley era, in terms of the use of the tariff, or is this something fairly new?
Not so much with McKinley. I mean, it is certainly a feature of the 20th century, even really beginning in the early 20th century, around the era of the First World War, where people used the threat of tariffs and were willing to negotiate what were called reciprocal tariff or reciprocal free trade agreement, so that the threat of tariffs became, and the individual negotiation of exceptions to it became very commonplace beginning in the era of the First World War in the 1910s and really getting going in the 1930s and after. But I think you do point up something important here, which is that tariffs were not, under McKinley, just a device for the protection of domestic industry and manufacturing, even though that was an important goal, that they served other political and indeed cultural purposes. So for the Republican Party of McKinley and Trump, it was a way that they could hold together a diverse coalition, and in part because of what the tariff revenues were used to finance. So in that late 19th century Gilded Age period, in the American North, there were a lot of people who were veterans of the Union Army during the Civil War, and of course, their family members, and they were receiving pensions from the federal government. And the tariff was the main source of revenue for the federal government. So those pensions were being paid by that. So even people that weren't involved in manufacturing, even people like farmers who economically did not like tariffs because they wanted to export goods, they approved of the tariff as a way of funding those Civil War pensions. So it was a way of holding together the Republican Party's electoral coalition. It also appealed to a certain kind of American nationalism. And we can hear echoes of that in Trump's invocation of the tariff as a tool to make America great again. The sense that the United States is being ill-treated by the rest of the world, and that tariffs are a device that can make other nations respect the United States because, as Trump suggests, they hadn't been in recent years.
So tariffs is one part of what Trump admires in the McKinley era. The other that you mentioned is imperialism and the beginning of well, historians kind of contest the idea of the informal versus the formal empire, but this is the beginning of what you might call formal empire, right? Actual territory abroad that is being taken over from the European powers and brought under direct American sovereignty. So could you just go a little bit more into debates over imperialism at the time? What was McKinley's stance? What was the Republican Party's stance on imperialism? And why during that period did formal empire emerge in the way that it did?
Yeah. So I think that I would, before getting to your question, I would add one thing to your, I think, important distinction between formal and informal empire, or between the incorporation of territory on the North American continent and the incorporation of these overseas territories that had been the possessions, or at least the colonial possessions of other European powers. Is that one thing that was very different about this new form of imperialism was that the natives of those places were widely considered by Americans to be ineligible for citizenship and incorporation into the American nation. So one of the things about the continental empire, if we want to think about that, is that even though not all of those people that were there could become citizens, all of those places in the American West did become states, and they had representation in Congress. They could vote in elections, whereas the Philippines, Puerto Rico, etc., did not become states and have not yet become states. So with that sort of caveat in mind, I think you raise a really interesting question about why empire in this period. And we have to remember that there was by no means any kind of overwhelming national consensus pointing toward the taking of overseas empire, that the nation had a long history of at least reticence, if not outright opposition, to the seizure of colonial territories. dating back to its own origins in an anti-colonial war of independence against British colonial power in the 18th century, that as late as 1895, so that's just a few years before becoming a colonial power overseas, the United States Congress had rejected the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. There was a chance to annex Hawaii. The Congress said no to that. So while there were many forces pointing toward imperialism in the late 19th century, economic forces, especially worries about the exhaustion of public lands, about the need for overseas markets as a safety valve to let out economic tensions and class conflict at home, geopolitical concerns about among some people who wanted really to establish the United States as a world power and thought that only by having overseas colonies and military bases could you really be a player on the international stage. And even cultural concerns, a kind of crisis of manhood, if you will, in that as the United States became a nation in which more and more people were working in factories and in offices, they were working for large organizations. They were not out on the frontier as individuals working outside, that somehow some quality of manhood was being lost and that it could only be restored through the physical fitness and the martial virtues of warfare. All of these things kind of pointed toward that imperial thrust, but also there were many things that pointed against it. And so what is interesting is the almost historical accident, the contingency of the decisions for war and empire in 1898. Because what happened there was that the United States intervened first in an ongoing rebellion of Cubans who wanted independence from Spain and who were resisting the cruel practices of the Spanish colonial government in Spain. And so what was odd was that imperialists, people that wanted the United States to become a colonial power, wanted war with Spain. But even many anti-imperialists thought the United States should intervene on the side of the Cubans in a kind of anti-colonial struggle. And it was only in the wake of the victory against Spain in Cuba and the almost accidental incursion of American naval forces into the Philippines, then also a Spanish territory as part of that war, that the question of empire came onto the table. And unlike the Donald Trump of 2025, maybe more like the Donald Trump of 2017, 18, 19, William McKinley was a somewhat reluctant imperialist. He certainly did not go to war with Spain with a clear plan that he wanted to take Spanish territory. But for a variety of reasons, in the wake of war, he made the decision for empire.
And lastly, Bruce, as a historian of this era, as Trump and his advisors continue to look to this era as a point of inspiration, what do you think would be something that would be important for Trump and his advisors to know about this era as they continue to shape policy?
You know, Ben, that's a great question, because I think definitely the most surprising thing about the embrace of this late 19th century era in general and of the presidency of McKinley as something to be celebrated in particular by Trump and the people around him is the one question I have for them. Have they read the next chapter in the US history textbook? Haven't they figured out what's happened? When they turn the page, well, guess what happened to William McKinley? He's going to be assassinated by an anarchist in 1901. Guess what's going to happen to the legacy of McKinley and the Gilded Age? McKinley's successor, Theodore Roosevelt, is going to usher in the very regulatory state that they are hoping to and have been trying to dismantle and usher in like a century of the growth of the federal government and its intervention in American economic and social life. So one of the consequences of this period they call a golden age was the downfall of McKinley and the kinds of policies that McKinley supported. And so I just wonder, have they read the next chapter? And maybe they should think about what happened the last time before they go too far down the same road.
Absolutely. Well, let's end it there. Bruce Schulman, thank you so much for joining Then and Now.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed being here.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.